about the history of your Islamic education.
So my education started primarily in Birmingham. I started works like Nahmir and Sarf and small Matun with our teacher Rasul Bakh Saidi, who's still based in Birmingham, and finished. In fact, one of the first works I read was Muqaddimah to Shaykh of Shaykh Abdul Haq, rahimahullah ta'ala. This was in around the year 98, so around the time when I delivered the lecture here.
MashaAllah.
And then I went to Damascus University to cover the language course. They had a 1-year language course before the war. I finished the language course in Damascus University, and then I finished books like Nur al-Idah, Al-Quduri, Matn al-Quduri, Al-Hidayah, Nur al-Anwar, Usul al-Shashi, Nur al-Anwar, Al-Husami, Muntakhab al-Husami. And in Aqidah we done Badu al-Amali with the commentary of Mullah al-Qari rahimahullah. And books of adab literature like Min Nafahat al-Khulud of Shaykh Salih al-Farfur rahimahullah. And many in Nahaw, the standard course, Sharh Miyati Amil, Hidayat al-Nahaw, Matn al-Kafiya and Mullah Jami. And then from that time, then I went back to Syria. So when I went back to Syria, I studied. There was a point of 2 years in Syria, the year from late 2004 up to within 2006. Within this period, there was a time when I had 20 duroos a week with various shuyukh. And this is excluding the majalis al-dhikr that I would attend. I would attend so many majalis al-dhikr that some people who didn't know I had 20 duroos a week, they thought I was doing more dhikr than I was studying. But alhamdulillah, that was very beneficial because I would attend the dhikr of Shaykh Taj al-Kattani rahimahullah, the son of Sayyid Makki al-Kattani, Shaykh Ahmad Habbal rahimahullah, and then the Shadili dhikr in the Nuriya that happens every Jummah after the Jummah prayer. So I would attend the majalis al-dhikr. But during that period of 2 years of 20 dars a week, I studied works like Kashf al-Haqa'iq of Abdul Hakim al-Afghani, Maraq al-Falah, Sharh al-Rahabiyya in Mirath, Muqaddimah ibn al-Salah. We completed these books. And then some of the Tadrib al-Rawi, the Muqaddimah of the Hashiyah of Ibn Abidin, the Muqaddimah of Sharh Sahih Muslim of Imam al-Nawawi, Sharh al-Waraqat, I'lam al-Anam of Shaykh Nuruddin Itr, with Shaykh Nuruddin Itr every Friday in the Jami Shamsiyah in the Muhajirin district. And Muhajirin district is the area where Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashimi rahimahullah lived. And then I've mentioned 9 books to you. Like this, if you counted all the books and the number of duroos, it would be about 20 for 2 years, mustamir. And then I returned back in 2006 for a short period. And in that period, I studied with the same teacher and another teacher. I studied some of the additional Dars Nizami books. And then I went back in 2007 and up to 2008 and studied Mazid with the Mashaykh in Damascus. I returned back in 2008. And then I stayed studying with my teachers for 4 more additional years and teaching under their instruction as well. So not just studying, I would teach. So I started teaching from that time until now to this day. Alhamdulillah, that's just a brief history of my studies.
MashaAllah. Yeah. Tremendous dedication that we're benefiting from today. One final question regarding your studies. If you could go back in time and meet yourself again, what advice would you give yourself for the benefit of students of knowledge here? That if you were to restart your education, knowing what you know now, your experience studying the ulama, what advice would you give to yourself?
You see, this question has passed my mind, but I avoided responding to the question because the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His qada and qadar wanted, willed to mold me is how He willed to mold me. So if I go back in hindsight and think to myself, I could have done this like this or this like that, then I'm happy with the qada and qadr of Allah. So yes, I could, if I went back in a time machine, theoretically, there are a few things I would have done differently. But then I'm happy with the qada and qadr of Allah, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala molds us through our personal experiences in the way He wills.
MashaAllah. MashaAllah.
So sometimes people will go through an experience which they deem as being bad, but in reality everything is good because it's from Allah.
MashaAllah.
And if we do not undergo that experience, for instance, there was, from that period of 1997 till 2001, it was difficult studying, because sometimes the teacher would give me a Qadimi Kutub Khana's copy of Nahmir in Farsi, and I still joke with my teacher regarding this. A Qadimi Kutub Khana copy of Nahmir in Farsi, he's teaching me in Urdu, and then I have to, as a British-born child, I have to, whose first language is not Urdu, it's English and Mirpuri. I have to process the Urdu, technical Urdu, then make sense of the Farsi text. So this process, I would not have studied as quick as a student studying under me. Children now can finish Nahmir under me because I teach them in English and very quickly, within a few weeks. But the process of studying was different then. And then sometimes walking miles to the class. So now children do not accept to attend a class if the class is far away. What do they say? We need a lift to the class, a car ride to the class. But now when I look back, that molded my mind, because benefiting from the handwritten lithographic editions of works, I can go and look at manuscripts. So if someone took me to a manuscript museum, I could decipher manuscripts. But a person who's trained on modern books, sometimes they're unable. So this is the benefits. I understand Urdu completely. I speak Urdu and I read Urdu. Farsi is very easy for me to decipher Farsi texts. That's the benefit. But I went under hardship in studying. So if I went back in time, I wouldn't change anything.
MashaAllah.
In that sense. So there's always benefit of even those things we deem as being hardship in our lives. And this will relate to the book in terms of what is referred to as the problem of evil. That people see as evil what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has willed for them.
MashaAllah, Jazakallah khair. I think it's important for us to appreciate, especially as listeners, myself as a student learning, that we often benefit from the fruits of a person, but we don't see their hard labor, like walking to the masjid when nobody's there at night, sleepless nights, studying, learning. Often people put a tremendous amount of effort in, and at the end, we benefit from the fruits. So it's really important that for the Sunni audience that we appreciate, mashallah, the hard work Sidi has gone through, inshallah, to learn the religion, not just in the UK, but multiple trips abroad, for us to sit here today, inshallah, and benefit from the fruits. So inshallah, moving on to the topic of our discussion today. The topic is Sunni Kalaam and modern atheism. So to start off with, what is Sunni Kalaam? Definition of Sunni Kalaam.
Sunni Kalaam, we would say, is the development of rational arguments against the detractors of Islam. So people who opposed Islam in the early centuries, from the time of the Sahaba alayhimu ridwan, you had the development of argumentation countering the arguments of the enemies of Islam, and that development became known as Kalaam. Now Kalaam, in its original designation, they even dispute why the word Kalaam was designated. Some of them say it was because it related to the Kalamullah, because one of the early disputes that they had with the Mu'tazila was that the Mu'tazila denied that the Quran is the Kalaam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this became a point of dispute. So the science to counter their arguments became known as Ilmul Kalaam, in reference to Kalamullah, Al-Quran Al-Kareem. While others said excessive Kalaam, excessive speech, is involved in dialectics, in debating the opponent, therefore the science became known as Ilmul Kalaam. Not to be confused with the Ilmul Kalaam of the Mu'tazila and the philosophers, which was condemned by Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. The early Salaf, as-Salaf as-Salihun, they condemned Kalaam. Which Kalaam did they condemn? As Ibn Asakir rahimahullah points out in Tabyinul Kadhib al-Muftari, they were condemning the Kalaam of the Mu'tazila, the Kalaam of the philosophers. So if you ever read statements of Imam Malik or Imam Shafi'i condemning Kalaam, they are not condemning Sunni Kalaam. Otherwise, Sunni Kalaam was utilized by the Salaf. What do I mean? Argumentation. Now, some people, they confuse that with the philosophical usage or the terms, philosophical terms that are utilized by Sunni mutakallimin in the later development of Kalaam, from the time of Al-Imam al-Juwayni, Al-Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who passed away in 505 Hijri, and onwards Al-Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, who passed away in 606 Hijri. These ulama, they utilize philosophical terms. So some people think the Sunni Kalaam is actually philosophy, when in reality it's a refutation of philosophy. It's not a commendation of philosophy. It's not commending philosophy. It's actually a condemnation of philosophy. And therefore, Al-Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's work, Tahafatul Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. So the Sunni mutakallimin, the Asha'ira, have always been opponents of philosophy or philosophical thought. They always dismantled philosophical arguments. And that is the relevance of Kalaam today. That Kalaam has a relevance today.
Speaking about Kalaam today, the first chapter of the book, Islam and Atheism, as you will know very well, Allama Sa'duddin Taftazani in Shara' Aqaid discusses the development of why Kalaam started, the fitna and the difficulties. Do you feel that we have similar problems today as it was in the past in terms of difficulties in theology, and we need Kalaam just as important as it was in the past?
So, there's a village in Wales known as Heian Wai, and they have a book village. It's an interesting place for you to visit. They have all these various bookshops. Once, many years ago, I went to buy a few books. I bought Bertrand Russell's autobiography in 3 volumes. And I also purchased, alongside many other interesting books, a book by Anthony Flew, the man, the philosopher who debated prominent Christian theologians, but later adopted the belief in deism toward the end of his life. Even though Richard Dawkins said his mind had diminished in his old age. But when you watch Anthony Flew's interviews, the conclusion he draws and the attributes of the God he believes in, many of those attributes are the attributes that we study in Sunni Kalaam, like al-wujud, al-qidam, al-baqa, these type of attributes. He had a book on the existence of God. I took this book back home. It was summertime. I read the book and I had a red pen and I underlined all the arguments against the existence of God. This copy I still retain. If you peruse through the book, you will find that every argument he has against God and the existence of God are all old arguments of the Mu'tazila. So the Mu'tazila, an old group that existed over 1200 years ago, the same arguments are regurgitated by an English philosopher. These arguments have been dismantled and debunked by Sunni mutakallimin hundreds of years ago. So similarly, when you study the arguments of Christopher Hitchens or all these various atheists, prominent or non-prominent, academic and non-academic, vociferous or non-vociferous, vitriolic or non-vitriolic, all the various types of atheists that you have, you study their arguments, and anyone who has studied Ilm al-Kalam will realize most of them are fallacies, fallacious argumentation, incendiary talk, just to spark emotions in people. And even the deep philosophical arguments that they will bring forward have already been dismantled in the classical Kalam. People use the word tradition, so I'll use the word tradition. Classical Kalam tradition.
Afwan said, could you give us an example of what he uses as an argument that the Mu'tazilites used, and also the response from Sunni ulama?
So an example is the qidam of the sifat of Allah. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the pre-eternal nature of the divine attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That the Mu'tazila, they opposed Ahl Sunnah. They said to Ahl Sunnah, They refer to themselves as Ahlul Tawheed because they deem the Ahlul Sunnah, and this is the irony, because today people say the Ash'aris deny the attributes of Allah. The Wahhabis, they say, some people are against me using the word Wahhabi, so I'll use the word Najdi for our convenience. Some of the Ahlul Najd, they say the Ash'aris deny the attributes of Allah, and they are Jahmiyyah. Now Jahm bin Safwan was an early, not even a Mu'tazili, just an early philosopher who denied the sifat of Allah to the point that he declared Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as nothingness. La shay. He said you cannot even say shay, something regarding Allah. He denied everything. To compare them, those Jahmis, with Ash'ira is a fallacy. Because the Ash'ira, they affirm the attributes, and some of these people, they falsely say Ash'ira only affirm 7 attributes or 20 attributes, which is also false. But the Mu'tazila labeled the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah as being mushrikeen. Based upon what? They said you believe in multiple qudama, multiple entities that were qadim, pre-eternal, meaning the attributes of Allah. So then the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they responded by demonstrating what, the argument in Sharh al-Aqaid regarding the attributes not being Ainul Dhat and neither Ghayru Dhat. Now some people, they think this is contradicting logic, when the meaning of this is simply that the attributes are not separated from the Dhat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because they are not separable from the Dhat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are not entities or qadim entities that contradict the tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now Anthony Flew utilizes similar type of arguments, that if there was a God and he had attributes, then those attributes would have to be eternal. But these things have been answered by the Ahl Sunnah to the point that, remember, the Mu'tazila never finished, they never expired because of persecution. The Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah never persecuted the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila persecuted the Ahl Sunnah. But eventually the Mu'tazila expired and finished with time because of a group of ulama who are known as the mutakallimin. And these are not dry mutakallimin. They are not people of just the rational mind. Because Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala was a Sufi. They were also Sufis. So knowledge is not limited just, we do not worship the mind. We are not ubadul aql. So Abdul Rahman Hassan, he said regarding the Ash'ira that they have shahwa of the aql, desire of the aql. This is false. We do not worship the aql. The aql is a tool, an instrument that we utilize to dismantle arguments, but the aql is subservient to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And just a false argumentation that he presented was that Al-Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi states that the aql comes before the nas. It's a misquote because he uses secondary and tertiary sources. Anyone who listens to him will realize he's quoting secondary and tertiary sources. He never goes to primary sources. So it's a false claim that we give precedence to the aql over the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Just building upon that, people often say that the Sunni ulama were either people of aql, rationalists, or the people of tasawwuf. Do you feel there were two separate things amongst scholars, or is it one of the same?
I believe they are one. Al-Imam al-Qushayri rahimullah is a fine example of this. He was an Ash'ari Imam, but he was the finest of Sufis. He wrote his famous book Ar-Risala al-Qushayri. But he also defended the Ash'ari creed. And he was Shaykh to Ali al-Hajwari, rahimahullah, the author of Kashf al-Mahjub, who was buried in Lahore. They're all linked. These were people of tasawwuf and ilm al-kalam. At times you may have some mutakallimin who may be deemed as being dry mutakallimin in the modern age. But generally speaking, traditionally in every century, the Ash'ira are a colorful group. You have the muhaddithin Ash'ira, like Al-Imam Al-Bayhaqi, Al-Imam Al-Nawawi, Al-Imam Ibn Hajar Al-Asqalani, Al-Imam Jalaluddin Al-Suyuti, Al-Imam Al-Qastalani, So many of them. Similarly, you have purely mutakallimeen asha'ira, like Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, and many others. Then you have the likes of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Imam al-Juwayni. Then you have the likes of Imam Muhammad bin Yusuf al-Sanusi, who was a muhaddith. He wrote a commentary on the Sahih of Imam Muslim, but also a mutakallim who refined ilm al-kalam from all the philosophy. He removed all the philosophy from ilm al-kalam. So it's a false notion for anyone to say the Ash'aris are just philosophers, or for anyone to say the Ash'aris are not even at the pinnacle of intellect. This is false. They had the best intellects. Just because they didn't delve into worldly sciences, it doesn't entail that they did not have the best intellect. So it's a colorful group, and for someone to say they are purely philosophers is false. They covered every field.
MashaAllah. Just building upon that, as you mentioned, Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashimi, his Miftah al-Jannah was one of the first books in Aqeedah that I studied personally. Is this one of the ways we can protect our Sunni community from those charlatans, fake beards? Because tasawwuf is almost like a science of dhikr without ilm today, without the aql. Do you think this is one of the ways that we can protect the Sunni ulama by having our leaders being experts in the aqliyat as well as tasawwuf and the naqliyat?
So you mentioned Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashimi rahimahullah. He's the Shaykh of Shaykh Abdul Rahman al-Shahuri, Shaykh Shukri al-Luhafi, and so many other major awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashimi said regarding ilm al-suluk or tasleek, that it is nadir jiddan, very rare that someone actually does suluk. But he was a person who, at his hands, so many people became abdal. He died in 1961. He fought jihad against the French, and he would always wear libas askari, the army uniform. He would carry guns, and sometimes he would wear the Moroccan thobe over the uniform, the askari uniform.
His photos are often like that when he's
with the army uniform, because he fought jihad. And this is why at the end of my book, the intellectual intifada, I have pictures of examples of Ahlul Halli wal Aqd and Mujahideen. Who do I place? Umar al-Mukhtar, Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashimi, as an example of someone who embodied Islam. His students alone, they demonstrate how the rijal of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are. Now what did he do? He went to the masajid and he taught Barahin of Imam as-Sunusi rahimullah. He taught the people Tawheed. He taught them the attributes of Allah, the ahkamul aql, the rational judgments, ahkamul shara', the legal judgments, ahkamul ada, made that common knowledge amongst the people. But then he also did tarbiyah of the people by giving them al-wirdul am, the shadli wird. The shadli wird, which is a basic wird. Nowadays some people refer to it as a wird of shirk, waliyadhu billah. It's a wird from the Quran and Sunnah. He gave out the shadli wird. And then selectively from his top students, he did their tarbiyah, nurturing them. He nurtured them on the Quran and Sunnah. And remember, the manhaj of Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashimi has its roots with Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Shadhili, but also with Shaykh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi rahimahullah, who was a man of Quran and Sunnah, irrelevant to the claims of his critics. So even the likes of Imam Taqiyuddin al-Subki rahimahullah, people mention his criticism of Shaykh Muhyiddin. They do not mention he retracted that. Similarly, Sultan al-Ulama al-Izz bin Abd Salam rahimahullah, he retracted his criticism. He praised the Shaykh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. And when you actually read Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, you will realize that the man was upon the Quran and the Sunnah. So Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashimi embodied that. And many other of the ulama, Shaykh Hassan Habannaka rahimahullah, all these ulama, Shaykh Abdul Karim al-Rifa'i, these were great people who taught the people Tawheed, and they taught them the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they embodied the practice of Islam also.
MashaAllah, Jamil. Just regarding Shaykh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi and the Akbarian school, because the Ottoman entire heritage is really based upon him. Dawood Qaisri, I believe, was the first Ottoman educational minister, and he has a hashia on his Fusul al-Hikam. So when it comes to people like Shaykh Muhyiddin and other great awliya, do you believe today for the Sunni community, because that's our heritage, these great people, how does the Sunni community today benefit from people similar today, or what type of qualities should we look for when we look for a shaykh? Because as we know in our communities, often there's peers and sheikhs, and we have great people in our communities, but we have the opposite, people that misuse our community. What type of qualities do you think that we should look for when looking for a shaykh or a guide or someone to help us in our faith?
So in the UK, the general advice is you stick to the creed of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Your shaykh is through as-salawat and salam upon the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You stick to the Sharia of Allah according to the madhab that you follow. The majority here follow the Hanafi school, but people follow one of the other three schools. You stick to the fiqh of that school, and you take benefit from all the mashayikh. So you attend the majalis of all the mashayikh. I do not restrict my students to specific Sunni mashayikh. They should go to all Sunni mashayikh, benefit from them, but do not limit yourself to one man in this time, in this country. That does not mean that there are not al-ulama al-murabbin. They exist. Al-murabbin, those who nurture students, like Ahmad Yahya Sirajuddin, the son of Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin, rahimahullah. They exist. But are we worthy of even attempting to claim that we do saluk at their hands? Have we reached the level? Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin, rahimahullah, when someone would take saluk with him, after they are given the wird, they would have to wake up 2 hours. This is a beginner. 2 hours before Salatul Fajr, pray tahajjud, and carry out certain awrad. That's the beginner level. So a person who is a thalik, if he's not praying Qiyamul Layl, he's not praying tahajjud, he's not praying Salatul Duha, he hasn't made up all his qada prayers, he hasn't paid all the zakat that he missed in his life, he hasn't made up the fast, all the fasts that he missed in Ramadan, he hasn't carried out his fard hajj, he hasn't given the rights of his parents, huququl walidain, he hasn't paid off all his debts, he has no huququl ibad on his shoulders, like ghiba and namima and hasad, then he is not even a salik. So people have to be realistic. So how should we be realistic? Shaykh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi rahimahullah relates tahqiqul fard. He mentions tahqiqul fard. What is tahqiqul fard? Complete your fard. Do your fard. What is fard upon you? Complete your fard. He states otherwise, claiming to do mustahab, claiming to do mandub, claiming to do sunnah becomes a shahwa. A person does the additional things out of shahwa, but he is not doing his fard and avoiding haram. So in this day and age, Sahih Aqidah, by studying al-Barahin of Imam al-Sunusi or Tahawiyah. Secondly, following a madhab in fiqh, sticking to the fiqh of that madhab, not following anomalous opinions. And thirdly, salawat and salam upon the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam non-stop. And you can say, take a awrad, a wird like the Shadili wird or another wird, daily wird, or from the adhkar of Imam al-Nawawi, and take benefit from all Sunni ulama. If you see faults in those Sunni ulama, take what is good, leave what is bad, and take from all of them. Do not restrict yourself to one.
Would you agree that the relationship between Sunni Aqidah and Hanafis is umum usus min wajh, meaning there's some Sunnis that are Hanafi and there's some Sunnis that are not Hanafi, like the Shafi, Maliki, Hanbali, and then you have some Hanafis that follow the Sunni Aqaid, but then also there's a group of Hanafis that don't follow Sunni Aqaid. Would you agree with that statement?
Remember, in history there have been Mu'tazili Hanafis. Currently speaking, some of the Wahhabis, Najdis, they attempt to hijack the Maliki school. What do? Ibn Ashir's text, they removed the Sunni creed at the beginning. They removed the Sufi passages, or they annotate and they quote Salih al-Uthaymeen, attempting to hijack the school. But if we look at the trajectory of the four madhabs, the majority have always been Sunni. The main work in the Hanafi school in the late times is the Hashia of Ibn Abidin, Raddul Muhtar. So anyone claiming to be a Hanafi today and from Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, then let's make our marji' Hashia of Ibn Abidin. The Hashia of Ibn Abidin unites the Hanafis. So when you go back to the Hashia of Ibn Abidin, those who reject the Hashia, you will be able to discern the Sunni from the non-Sunni.
Jazakallah khair. Moving on to your second and third chapter in epistemology and also God's existence. From a purely rational point of view, how does learning ilm al-kalam help a Muslim build their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their worship?
So remember, shubuhat is doubts that occur in the mind. When a Muslim has any doubts in his mind regarding his aqidah, that causes weakness of iman. When you have weakness of iman, your ibadah is affected. But if you have a schema, a framework, an epistemology, a way of approaching knowledge, that will give you firmness with regard to certainty. And when a mu'min has certainty regarding Allah, regarding the Quran, regarding the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he will have ziyadatul iman, an increase in iman. Shaykh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi rahimullah, he mentions what is iman. He says, hub, love, increase of love is an increase of iman. Increase of love of Allah is an increase of iman. Increase of love of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is an increase of iman. That would entail that every believer should increase his love of Allah and his Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Meaning, whenever you look at murtad, apostate cases, you will notice a common theme that many of them are devoid of love of Allah. In the first place, they were not nurtured on the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the love of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and therefore they became devoid of iman. So having a methodology increases your iman, increases your worship, increases halawatul iman, the sweetness of iman. So qiyamul layl, tahajjud, as-salah bil jama'ah, praying in jama'ah, reading your awrad, your litanies, praying additional nawafil, all of this becomes easy when you do munajat with Allah. You beseech Allah, but all of that is easier when you have a stronger iman, without doubts, without shubuhat.
MashaAllah. Just regarding ilm al-kalam now, do you believe ilm al-kalam is a methodology to learn, or is it a subject matter that you study?
So ilm al-kalam is a subject matter, but every believer, every mu'min should have a segment of what is instructed in ilm al-kalam, meaning in the sense that some people, they cannot make a distinction between ahkamul aada and ahkamul aql. Two things. Ahkamul aada is what we refer to as scientific laws. Ahkamul aql is the rational judgment. They are two different things. So many times you have young people saying this does not make any rational sense, but they are referring to ahkamul aada, not to ahkamul aql. In that sense, it is essential for everyone to draw the distinctions so they do not fall into common fallacies. Like Richard Dawkins in an interview with Mahdi Hassan on Al Jazeera, he mentions the buraq as something unscientific, something irrational. But the easy response to Richard Dawkins would be that the existence of buraq is beyond the scientific methodology. Why? Because the buraq was an intergalactic, multi-dimensional animal or creature that entered this domain for a fraction of time, which is not contradicted by relativity. And when it entered this domain for a fraction of time, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam traveled on the buraq, an interdimensional being, and returned back beyond scientific investigation. Does that contradict the hukm al-aql? The answer is no. Is it beyond scientific investigation, which is hukm al-aada? The answer is yes. So the dismissal is based on lack of iman. Lack of iman led him to deny it. The mu'min believes in it because of iman. But does it contradict the rational judgment? The answer is no. But the jahil atheist, or the jahil murtad, will be unable to distinguish between hukm al-aql and hukm al-'ada, and not be even able to acknowledge the distinction. So there are many juhal, ignorant people, sometimes when dialoguing with them, they will not even acknowledge the distinction. And this is where we enter the domain of epistemology. You need a fixed epistemology. Otherwise, if you notice a common theme in the Khawarij, lack of usul. They have no usul. So they declare everyone kafir without principles. And the opposite, on the other spectrum, on the other side of the spectrum, you have those people who, the ibahiyun, meaning they validate everything. What do? They have no usul either. They have no principles. They do not have fixed usul. But Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah has a distinction. Al-Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah, he wrote his famous Ar-Risala. Ar-Risala was what? The legal theory, how to read and study the Quran and Sunnah. And this is what draws the distinction between Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah and other groups.
MashaAllah. Coming on to science in Islam, which I believe is chapter 5 in your book. And this categorization of hukum adi, hukum aqli, hukum shari, which is in the Sanusiya creeds and the commentaries. How important do you feel that is for young people? Because many people here have either studied at school or university. We have teenagers that are studying science at school. How do we reconcile what people are learning at school and the aqidah that they're being taught in the masajids or in places similar?
So as I mentioned, having a correct schema or a framework in order to process information is so important. We live in the day and age of information. But what we lack is regulation and processing. So someone can be exposed to so much information, especially when they have these not so smartphones, and people, when they access the information, they are unable to process this. You can ask doctors. Some people, they have symptoms. They type in the symptom on Google and they believe they have a particular disease. They may not have that disease. Similarly, with information, whether it's scientific, philosophical, theological, non-professionals, when they are exposed to that information, some of them will become arrogant. Like what happens to the young Salafi sometimes. When exposed to a verse of the Quran or the Sunnah, they will utilize that verse or the hadith in order to bash the head of the opponent. But they are unable to process the information. As I mentioned, Al-Imam al-Shafi'i's early work, Ar-Risala, gives a process of how to process a hadith. Is the hadith mudraj? Is the hadith muttarib? Is the hadith munqati'? Is the hadith da'if? Etc. Meaning all these things. Is it shadh? There's a process. Then the mechanics of usul. Is it aam? Is it khas? Etc. Looking at all of this. Similarly, scientific information. So if you notice in chapter 5, I place the categorization of science. So in school, in the year 1997, I was exposed to charts of supposed progress of man. So you had the pictures of man on a paper. And we were told this is factual. That man had all these various stages, and then meaning the process of evolution. But as you grow up and you read information articles, like recently, there was an artifact found in Africa which dates 1.5 million years, which changes the whole narrative of human migration and human development and the development of the mind, the human mind. Because they thought 1.5 million years ago man was not developed enough to make artifacts. But that changes significantly what we were taught in the 90s with regard to the development of humankind. So what is presented as fact in school, I am not advocating that young Muslims become flat earthers. I'm not advocating that Muslims dismiss science. No. In fact, our methodology is very scientific. History speaks for itself, meaning the Muslims historically were very scientific, the majority of them. And today, Islamic Kalaam, Ilmul Kalaam, the Sunni Ilmul Kalaam, this Ilmul Kalaam is not in contradistinction to science. What it does is it categorizes science where it belongs. So what do I mention? I mention absolute certainty, near certainty, doubt, and imagination. Some things in science are actual imagination. Some things are doubtful. They have some proof, but generally they are doubtful. Some have near certainty. Some have absolute certainty. The Muslim needs to know the framework in where does he categorize any specific scientific theory.
Alfonso, just on that, how do we practically then, as imams, masajids, committees, our local Sunni communities, or how do we practically learn that framework, that paradigm to process the information that we receive at school and in the world we live in today?
So practically you can refer to my book. In chapter 5, I present, if people just read chapter 5, they will have an exact method. An exact method is given in the book. The application is also with regard to the information you receive. For instance, you visit the London Science Museum. You go to London, you visit the London Science Museum and you observe all these various artifacts and fossils. What type of knowledge does that impart? Does it impart absolute certainty with regard to Neanderthal man and the nature of the prefrontal development of the front lobe of the Neanderthal man? What type of information does that actually depart to our methodology? Meaning, what conclusion do we draw from that? The answer is that you will never reach absolute certainty with regard to the evolution of man. So, knowing the categorization of all types of ulum is absolutely essential. Now, going back a bit to chapter 2, what do I mention? What we know from al-hawasul khamsa, the 5 sensory perceptions: seeing, hearing, smelling, taste, and touch. This gives absolute certainty. Similarly, the rational judgment. What is the rational judgment? A judgment formed solely from the mind, without any external reference. Like a blind and deaf man knowing 2 and 2 is 4. He did not come to that conclusion from an external thing. And thirdly, from what we refer to as tawatur, mass transmission of reports. These things impart absolute certainty. But scientific research on certain things does not give absolute certainty. It may impart doubt. Doubt here, by the way, doesn't mean it's doubtful in its entirety. It entails that it's not absolute certainty or near certainty. I'm using the word doubt as a technical term.
Okay. Regarding adults and people that can read your book, how would you advise parents then to instill that framework to their children at a young age?
Again, the Sunusiya is where you start. So al-Barahin, you study the al-Barahin with the local Imam. You can also listen to my online lecture of the entire al-Barahin. You make notes on that. If you teach them just hukm al-aql, hukm al-ada, hukm al-shara', they will have the requisite tools to categorize things in life.
I think Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashmi's book, Miftah al-Jannah, is an excellent introduction to the Sunusiya because he lays out the framework really, really well in his text. Coming on to science, what would you say regarding, because the scientific methodology, often Muslims say this is our heritage. The Muslims, they invented the scientific methodology. Would you say there's a distinction between the methodology in science, individual scientists and their view, and also the idea that science or scientism is the ultimate means to truth?
So there's 2 things here. One is, if some Muslims are claiming that the scientific method is their heritage, this is false. Science is a human heritage. It goes from civilization to civilization. We adopted much of Greek science. Muslims took from the Greeks, there's no doubt. They developed some of it and they passed it on to Europe. It's no big deal if Europe advances, but even though I do not think it's a point of boast for Europe or America by extension, because with science they developed the atomic bomb. With science they developed weapons that kill and maim. So science can be misused. Science doesn't teach you ethics and morals. So the Muslims had the scientific flag for a few hundred years, then the flag passed on to other groups. Now the flag may move on to China. Big deal, it doesn't matter. It's a human heritage. But there are some people who become enamored by the development of Europe and the progression in terms of economic development, social development, and prosperity in that regard, and they blame backwardness upon Islam when they are two totally distinct things. But Islam has the role of what? Of giving science an ethical safeguard. It has an ethical and moral safeguard. Now, with regard to scientism, which is the actual worship of science, it has its limitations and flaws. Science is only the study of the material world. It cannot tell you, with regard to the metaphysics, what is beyond the physical. Ma wara'a tabi'a. Secondly, science cannot answer moral questions, ethical questions. It can tell you how something functions, but it will not tell you the purpose. It can tell you how the human body, the biological functioning occurs, but it does not tell you the purpose of the human being. So scientism, if someone takes scientism as a way of life, like some people take misguided LGBT as a way of life, some people take fluffies and flurries and whatever other things you have as a way of life. Islam is a way of life. But if someone takes science as a way of life, they will end up in a conundrum. They will have conundrums in their life where they will be unable to answer certain questions.
Just regarding that, how important is it then for young Muslims that are studying at university? Many of our parents want their children to study medicine, to become doctors, studying chemistry, biology, physics at A-level and university. How important is it for young Muslims to learn their Aqidah, and what are the potential consequences of not learning your Aqidah and then dwelling into a deep study into science?
Most of the time, those who fall into shubuhat and doubts tend not to be from scientific backgrounds. And if they are, they sometimes fall back into the deen of Allah. There are people, young people, who may have studied physics, astrophysics, other fields of science, and they may have fallen out in terms of their iman. But later on, as they develop in their life, they have character development, they go through a journey, they return back to iman. But those who become more corrupted intellectually are the ones who delve into the field of philosophy. So it's absolutely essential that they study even a basic book like the work of Imam Ahmad bin Zaini Dahlan, the Essential Islamic Creed. That book is in English, by the way, the Essential Islamic Creed. They should study at least that much. You will be surprised how little you can study and protect your iman for life. Meaning you do not need to read big works of Kalaam to protect your iman. You can even read something as simple as the Essential Islamic Creed of Imam Ahmad bin Zaini Dahlan, and you will realize how fallacious and stupid atheist arguments actually are. You even read this book, you will realize the arguments have no foundation, they have no strong foundation. You listen to Christopher Hitchens, you will realize most of the arguments are fallacious.
Coming back to, you mentioned the atomic bomb and technology in the West, so moving on to the problem of evil. So within Western countries, generally the Western heritage is based upon the Greek tradition and the Roman tradition, and in the UK you had the pagan society and then Christianity. So the problem of evil was generally an issue that was brought up against Christianity. So from an Islamic perspective, has this been an issue in our heritage and history, the problem of evil? And then second of all, how do we tackle the discussion in the West regarding the problem of evil?
So again, referring back to Anthony Fleur's book, you asked me earlier what type of arguments.
Just for the benefit of the audience, you can specify what the problem of evil actually is, and then go on to explain.
So the problem of evil he's asking about is the fact that we have evil in the world, or what is defined as evil, suffering, human suffering, animal suffering. They refer to that as being evil, and then they say it's a problem, the problem of evil, in the sense that if God was so good, if God existed, then why does evil exist? Why doesn't God terminate evil? It's in reference to that argument. That argument was utilized also by the Mu'tazila. So the Mu'tazila had a problem with the fact that the Sunni creed or the Muslim creed is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates everything. Min sharri ma khalaq, from the evil of what He creates. The Sunnis had no problem with this. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has sifatul af'al, the attributes of divine actions. So He is al-muhyi, the one who gives life. He is also al-mumit, the one who gives death. He is al-khafid, the one who lowers, but He is also al-rafi'. He is al-mudhil, the one who disgraces, but He is also al-mu'izz, the one who raises and exalts people. So the Sunnis never had a problem with this, but the Mu'tazila found it problematic when engaging with Christians and philosophers. So what did they do? They claimed firstly that Allah does not create the actions of people. People create their own actions. So this led now to problem, discussion in Kalaam. Second thing they denied, or groups of them, Qadr is created by humans. Humans create their own destiny. A kind of creed that some Westerners also hold, that humans create their own destiny. And then they found it problematic to understand that if Allah knows everything, then why did He not just place everyone in paradise or hellfire? These type of conundrums and questions like, can God create a boulder so big He Himself cannot raise the boulder? Absurd questions. And then they questioned human free will. And then they also questioned the fact that they said Allah must do that which is better, salih and aslah, that which is better for every human being. Eventually that was what made Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari rahimahullah depart from the Mu'tazila when he questioned Ali al-Jubai. The story is that he questioned Ali al-Jubai and he had him dumbfounded. Ali al-Jubai was unable to answer. What did the Mu'tazila believe? They believed that Allah must do what is better for us. So they made something wajib upon Allah. And the Shia then adopted this creed. How? The Shia, the modern Twelvers, they believe that it is an obligation on Allah to send down Imams. Allah must send down Imams. So this is how, again, Anthony Flew utilizes these type of arguments. So the problem of evil in the early period affected the Mu'tazila, but then the Sunnis responded. They responded intellectually. Of course, the Sunnis do respond with the Quran and Sunnah first, but they give intellectual responses to all of these claims. For instance, the Ahl Sunnah, they say evil is subjective. What we may term as being evil, the divine action of Allah cannot be described as evil. Allah and His divine actions are not evil, because evil is subjective. When a human does something, the action of the human can be described as evil, because the very definition of evil is what is a tasarruf fi mulkil ghayr. Yes, the violating of someone else's property. But how can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intervening in the creation be deemed as evil when the whole creation belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the first place? So even the death of a child, or the suffering of a child, or the suffering of an animal, this, when ascribed to Allah in terms of Allah creating that, cannot be termed as being evil in the first place. Evil is subjective. Al-Imam Abu Hamd al-Ghazali gives the example in Al-Iqtisad of a snake. For the snake, its poison is bad for the victim. But for the snake itself, the poison is good. It keeps the snake alive. So even poison of a snake is subjectively evil. And then the Ahl Sunnah, they respond to the claim with regard to human free will. They respond to that. They say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates everything in the sense that if I decide now that I'm feeling thirsty, which I am, I pour water into this cup. Now, when He decides to take the bottle and pour the water, His hand is created by Allah. The bottle is created by Allah. The cup is created by Allah. When I drink the water quenches my thirst by the will of Allah. But what am I exercising? I have the free will to exercise the holding of the cup and lifting the cup but then the action is created by Allah. But when I say insha'Allah, that is the meaning of insha'Allah, because sometimes if someone intends to do something, the means, the asbab are not there, because the person may not be able to move the hand. The cup could disappear. The water may not quench my thirst. So Allah creates everything, but there is something within the human being which is known as the exercising of free will, which is kasab. So the Sunni ulama, the theologians, responded to all their arguments, and they dismantled them to the point that they have no weight in the Muslim world. Some modern people attempt to revive the arguments, but when they are countered, they have no basis, and then people leave those type of arguments.
MashaAllah. Just coming back to a word you've been using, Ash'ari or Ash'a'ira. This is often a word that certain groups they like to use to say that Ash'aris are not Sunnis, and especially in Speaker's Corner, which you have a lot of people there debating, and it's on YouTube. This word's thrown around a lot. The Ash'aris, the Ash'a'ira, they deny the Sifat of Allah. They're not Sunnis. Can you just define who is this group and who do we call the Ash'a'ira?
So, with regard to this, with regard to those people in Hyde Park, the problem for me is that Hyde Park is far from Birmingham. Unfortunately, you London Sunnis, not you, the London Sunnis, they have not got one rajul to go down to Hyde Park and counter their arguments, fallacious arguments. Where are you Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah in the whole of UK? Where are your debaters and your peers and all these people? Go into Hyde Park and debate them. In London is full of Sunni masajid. You need to counter their arguments. Now, why do they make these arguments? There is actually a propaganda campaign against Ash'ari. What is that propaganda campaign? That the Ash'aris deny the sifat of Allah, or they only attribute 7 attributes. This is a false propaganda. The Ash'aris affirm the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though their texts instruct the people regarding 20 essential attributes. It doesn't mean they deny all the other attributes. So what the modern Salafi movement has done, an entire funded propaganda tarnishing campaign, a smear campaign against the Ash'ari, which is to say they are Jahmiyyah, they are Mu'tazila, they are grave worshippers. Seriously speaking, in our Sunni masajid you do not have graves, and people do not do sajda to the graves. But there is a smear campaign. There was even one prominent London person who mentioned to me all his life he thought that Barelwis were people who placed chairs in the masjid. They place a chair in the front of the masjid, and they believe the Prophet ﷺ sits on the chair. Waliyadu billah. Unheard of concepts. Or for instance, stating that they believe the Prophet ﷺ is the actual nur of Allah, from Allah's essence. They believe, these are false claims. They believe that the Prophet ﷺ has equal knowledge to Allah. Waliyadu billah. Such type of false notions. So Hyde Park is full of false notions, and you need a well-equipped Ash'ari, well-tooled, well-instructed, eloquent and cogent to go down and deal with these goons and silence their arguments, because it's a propaganda campaign. Inshallah, I am preparing an army from Birmingham to go down of students of knowledge, Tullabul Ilm. But it's an obligation on our community to counter these type of fallacious arguments. Young people should not fall into the 2 claims. Number 1, Ash'aris deny the sifat of Allah. False.
Afwan Sidi, can you just give us an example of that? What do they mean by when we say we deny the sifat of Allah?
So for instance, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is described with what? Yad. Tabarakalladhi biyadihi. Yes?
Yadullahi fawqa aydihim.
Yadullahi fawqa aydihim. Yad is ascribed to Allah in an annexed form. What do I mean by annexed form? Yad is annexed to the pronoun yadihi. Do we deny that? No. Do we affirm it? Yes. Do we even affirm it as sifa of Allah? Yes. So stop there. That is the belief of the Salaf. They say no, you don't. They probe the issue. They do not follow the Salaf, because Al-Imam Malik rahimahullah, if someone affirmed to him the attributes, they would leave it there, they would not probe the matter more. So we say these are attributes of Allah. You leave it to that point. But then they probe the issue, they say, what do you mean by yad? We say sifa. If you left it to that point, they say no, because there's an entire strawman argument that they need to present, that you Ash'aris are actually denying the reality of the yad. What is the reality? They cannot utter what they mean by that reality. What they actually mean by the reality. We say we do tafweedul ma'na and tafweedul ma'na to Allah. What do we mean by tafweedul ma'na? This is important. They say when you do tafweedul ma'na, they say you have denied the meaning. Because what does tafweedul ma'na mean? Tafweedul ma'na means we defer the meaning to Allah. So they say when you do tafweedul ma'na, you have negated the meaning. So they say we know the meaning. We say to them in response to that the general meaning is known in the Arabic language. But specifying a meaning is with certainty is only known to Allah. Specifying a meaning with certainty is only known to Allah. If an alim like Al-Imam al-Nawawi or Al-Imam Ibn Hajar specifies a meaning, they do not specify it with certainty. So for yad, linguistically can have multiple meanings. We affirm the general meaning and leave the specific meaning to Allah. And we affirm it as a sifatul ma'na, quality of Allah, an attribute. But specifying the meaning with certainty we do not do. If some ulama did so, it's the ijtihad. This is known as ta'wil. They say this ta'wil and tafweedul ma'na, you have negated the actual attribute. This is false. Because if they say they know the meaning, then why do they not tell us the meaning? Why they do not tell us the meaning is because what they mean by the actual meaning is limbs, which we negate. So they actually mean limbs. So Salih al-Uthaymeen, on record, it's known, he has said that we do not affirm a jism for Allah, a body for Allah, but neither do we negate it because Allah hasn't negated it. So when they say that when they say regarding themselves that the Salafis affirm the attribute, what they mean is that they imply a limb. They imply it. But the Ash'aris say no, we affirm a quality, an attribute of Allah in the general meaning, we affirm it, but the specific meaning we leave to Allah. And if any scholar does ta'wil, what does ta'wil mean? Specifying a meaning without absolute certainty. This is the subject in summary. Then it has other details with regard to their source books and our source books, authenticating some of these books ascribed to Al-Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, the aqwal of the Salaf. With regard to the aqwal of the Salaf, when the Salaf say things like, Allah is fawq al-arsh, we affirm that. How do we affirm that? We say Allah is fawq al-arsh. This fawq, aboveness, is fawqiyya mutlaqa, unrestricted aboveness. وَهُوَ الْقَاهِرُ فَوْقَ عِبَادِهِ. He is al-qahir, the one who subdues above his servants. So Allah is fawq al-arsh. But they were saying this in response to the Jahmiyyah. What did the Jahmiyyah say? The Jahmiyyah said Allah is everywhere bidhati. So the Salaf were refuting them. Or for instance, when the Salaf say bidhatihi, if it is authentic, they mean la bi ghayrihi. That when they say Allah is above the arsh bidhatihi, with his essence, they mean and with an aboveness that he is not in need of anything else. Or for instance, when they utilize the word had, that Allah has a had, a limit, that only He knows, what do they mean? They mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not indwelling in creation. So even the statements they quote from the Salaf, we have our own particular understanding of those statements. So they cannot even bamboozle us with these statements of Sufyan al-Thawri. There are some extreme Ash'aris who deny these statements sometimes because they cannot explain them away. We affirm the Athari creed, Ash'aris. We affirm the sifat of Allah. But we do not need to negate those attributes of Allah, and we do not need to even deny the aqwal of the Salaf. We accept the aqwal. But how they are understanding the aqwal is different to how we understand the aqwal. I hope that's sufficient detail for young Sunnis to go to Hyde Park and dismantle their arguments, inshallah.
Inshallah. Just regarding Ash'ari, because traditionally we hear Ash'ari and Maturidi, and Hanafis, generally speaking, in India, Pak subcontinent, they claim to be Hanafis and Maturidis. Is there any particular reason why you mention Ash'ari and not Maturidi, or do you include the Maturidi within the Ash'ari?
So this is used by way of taghlib. What is taghlib in ilm al-balagha? You have taghlib, a concept in ilm al-badi', which is that you mention one thing, two things with one name. So aswadain for dates and water. Water is not black, but you say the two black things, dates and water. Or qamarain for the sun and moon. Or shaykhain for what? For Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and Sayyidina Umar radiyallahu anhuma. Similarly, Asha'ira is taghlib. It includes Maturidis and Atharis. Secondly, in the Indian subcontinent, some people, they say we are Maturidi, but they do not even realize that Al-Imam Ahmad Rida Khan rahimullah, he opposed the Maturidi positions. He was in fact an Akbari. He had Akbari positions. He was pro Shaykh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi rahimullah.
Just to clarify, Akbari, what do you mean by Akbari here?
Akbari is in reference to a hybrid. That hybrid is if you have a mixture of not the thoughts of Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, because he wasn't a philosopher. Do not believe that Ibn Arabi was a philosopher. Ibn Arabi was a man of kashf. So what he wrote down, very few people actually understand him, by the way. Very few people actually understand him. There are many ulama who were influenced by Ibn Arabi to the point that Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari rahimullah was Akbari. His students were Akbari. That means the entire Shafi'i school post Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari with Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani, al-Ramli, all these people, they were all Akbari. They were influenced by Ibn Arabi. In the Indian subcontinent, Imam Ahmad Rida Khan was Akbari. He was influenced by the teachings of Ibn Arabi. That is why he is also misunderstood by some people. He's misunderstood. People do not read his actual works like Al-Qawl al-Najih. They just take the words of others in order to tarnish the man. But in reality, he was an Akbari. But I use the word Ash'ari as an umbrella term which includes all of these various groups. And I tend to stick to the mainstream Ash'ari thought.
Just regarding the Akbarian, because the whole Ottoman tradition, and because of the episodes of Ertugrul and Osman, the Ottoman tradition is a bit more prevalent in people's minds, but the entire Akbarian school, from the Ottoman perspective, if you look at the great scholars like Mullah Fanari and the great scholars that came afterwards, they were all influenced. You can argue that they were all Akbarian in their thought. So coming on to the last topic of today, before we open the question and answer, and chapter 6 in your book, Quran, Hadith and Sharia. The obvious question, which I think a lot of people have in their minds, which is sadly in the media, and also due to a small minority of Muslims that go around saying we need the Sharia. Can you just define what is the Sharia, and do we have a need for the Sharia right here living in the UK, especially those people that go out protesting that we want the Sharia?
So the Sharia is needed everywhere. There's no doubt. But it's a matter of how you display the need for Sharia. Carrying billboards and going outside of Parliament and saying, down with Parliament, we need Sharia, is not how you establish Sharia. How you establish Sharia is through da'wah ilallah. And argumentation in Hyde Park alone does not bring people to Islam. You need Sharia through what? Through bringing people to Al-Islam in the first place. So the objective of Muslims should be da'wah ilallah, calling people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When they come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they apply the Sharia upon themselves. So there is an approach. And the approach of the Sufis in the past was always to go into a region, bring people to Islam with love. Through love, bringing them to Islam. And that is what we are missing here in the UK and elsewhere. That I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that some wali of Allah, some Sufi, bring Islam to these shores, in the sense that at his hands thousands of English, Scottish and Irish people become Muslims.
Ameen.
At his hands. That is the real call to the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we do need Sharia, but what is the approach? Is it an aggressive approach without bringing people close to Allah, inculcating love of Allah in their hearts, love of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in their hearts first? Because you cannot bring Sharia without love. But as the status quo currently, we are living as what? A minority in this country. So what do? We just carry on with our call to Islam, to Tawheed and the correct teachings of Islam also.
MashaAllah. Final question for me before we open up for question and answer, because Salatul Isha will be read at 9 o'clock inshallah. It's just regarding, most people think of the Sharia as hudud, like punishments. So when we say Sharia, you cut people's hands or death penalty. Can you just give us a discussion of how broad the Sharia is in terms of its rulings for people?
So here I would say that even those things that people deem as being harsh in the Sharia are in fact a rahmah of Allah. I'll give you an example. Your question has two facets. One is, I want to demonstrate that even what is termed as being harsh laws are in fact not harsh. And secondly, the Sharia being broad. So with regard to the first, hudud of stoning for zina, for adultery, there is something known as crimes of passion. Generally speaking, I tend to read the headlines of Birmingham Mail. And Birmingham is an interesting city, second after London. You'll find many interesting crimes that occur. Some of those crimes sometimes is a man goes home or a woman goes home, they find their partner sleeping with another person, and they carry out a crime of passion where they murder. And in some cases, you had one case in Luton, a Muslim woman was sleeping with her own brother-in-law. Muslim woman. It was a famous case. When the wife of the man found out her sister was doing this zina, she confronted her. The sister-in-law, the zania, the adulteress, she killed her own sister. And then she was given a police interview and she lied that some intruder came in. These are known as crimes of passion. And there are many disturbing cases. Sometimes both partners are killed. Very horrific cases. So then you have our stoning law. Our stoning law, meaning the Sharia, the stoning law was in the Quran, the verse is mansukh, even though some scholars take nasikh mansukh, some say it doesn't exist in the Quran, meaning in terms of mansukh tilawa. But the correct position is mansukh tilawa did exist. Shaykh Abdullah al-Ghumari takes the position of mansukh tilawa didn't exist. But the correct position is that it did exist. But the stoning is found in the hadith, mass transmitted hadith. Stoning sounds harsh, that you stone someone to death for zina, but it's not harsh when you look at the sin of adultery. But I want you to consider something. Is the law ever carried out? In fact, if you check the works of Qanun in the Ottoman annals, you will find very rarely it was carried out in the Ottoman Caliphate. Very rarely. It was very rarely carried out. It's so difficult to carry out that, of course, many of you will know that the detail of 4 witnesses, they cannot contradict one another. They must see the act blatantly, in the sense explicitly with detail, to the point that if their witness accounts contradict, they will be lashed in public and shamed. So, and no one ever admits to doing such an act. So the law is very rarely applied. Then its application, with regard to its application, some people have an idea that the law is brutal in the sense of how it is carried out. Well, how a law is carried out can change from time and place. So how people carried out the law 500 years ago, in the modern age we may have a specific allocated area for the application of the law, which is congenial to the environment, etc. But also, if the person being stoned runs away, it's taken as denial of the action. And the qadi is not permitted, and the people are not permitted to chase after him. So he has the freedom to run away from the application of that law. The point being, the law is so nuanced, so detailed, but needed at the same time. Likewise, amputation of the hands. How many times have we heard of people entering into people's homes, strangling the entire family to death, taking their wealth? Amputation of the hand is a light punishment in comparison. But again, the law is very rarely carried out. It's not carried out if the person was stealing food. It's not carried out if the wealth stolen was meager in value. It's not carried out if the wealth is in public display. It's not carried out if the person was a guest at the house. It's not carried out if. So many shurut conditions. So this is with regard to harsh punishments in Islam. It's so nuanced. You can reference my book, Intellectual Intifada, a book on the restoring the caliphate in the modern age. It's my book on Sharia law. With regard to the second segment, Sharia law has good and superb guidelines and economy on feeding the stomachs of people. The waste that happens in modern capitalism would not occur under the application of Sharia law, that so many hungry people, man-made hunger, man-made in the sense that human beings are responsible. That is just one aspect of Sharia law, the economic application. Like this, you can look at various aspects of Sharia law, social aspects, which will make someone realize that the Sharia law is better for humanity than man-made law.
MashaAllah, Jazakumullah khair. Thank you for your time, MashaAllah, and your excellent explanation. I wish we could continue. I have lots more questions, but due to our time restraints, we're going to open it up, inshallah, for people to ask questions. If we could please have questions about the subject today, and then if we have time, inshallah, we'll open it up.
So people have sent in some questions, but before we go to the questions, I want to kind of take you back to one of the questions that atheists raise, and this is a question that gets asked in schools about kids in their RE and philosophy subjects, of if God is so powerful, can he create a rock so big that he can't lift it? So, I mean, from our perspective, it's a very absurd question, so I just wanted to kind of throw it out to the audience is if they have a think about that and how they would attempt to answer that question, then I'd like you to perhaps give them some practical advice on how to tackle questions like that.
So that question, remember, is so absurd that the question, and this is how you answer in your RS class. Say, teacher, the question is so absurd because in effect you are asking me, can God make himself powerless? And the answer is no. Can God make himself powerless? The answer is no. Why? Because the divine power does not relate to the logically impossible. It does not connect to that. We do not say God is powerless. We do not say God is unable. We say what? The qudra of Allah, the divine power of Allah, only relates to that which is possible. It doesn't relate to that which is impossible. Someone may say, why? The response is that if the divine power related to the impossible, that in effect would mean the impossible becomes possible. And the impossible becoming possible is impossible in itself.
Question here, if one can't comprehend God with Kuliyat al-Khamsa, is belief in God certain qati or speculative then?
Belief in God is qat'i. Why is it qat'i? Because firstly it's in your fitrah. That is not the position of only Ibn Taymiyyah, some people think. That's actually a Sunni position, that it's in our fitrah to believe in Allah. So Al-Hawasul Khamsa, the questioner asks, the five senses, if you limited yourself to the empirical senses, then you become an empiricist. You become an empiricist in the sense that you limit yourself and your knowledge of the universe to your five senses. But your knowledge of the universe is not limited to the five senses. Your knowledge of the universe also comes from the mutawatir, mass transmission, which informs you of kharqul aada, violation of the norms, which are known as miracles. Your knowledge of the universe is also from the mind. Your knowledge of the universe is also from the Quran and divine revelation. So you have other sources of knowledge. If you limit yourself to the five senses, this is a mistake in epistemology. You need to revise your epistemology.
Can I ask the next question from someone's text? They've said that, what arguments does the Quran, does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam present for the existence of God?
So in the Quran you have numerous arguments. One of the arguments, for instance, in Surah Al-Dahr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, هَلْ أَتَى عَلَى الْإِنسَانِ حِينٌ مِّنَ الدَّهْرِ لَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْئًا مَذْكُورًا. This is just one, what is known as istifham inkari, a rhetorical question. Has even a moment come upon the human being where he was something non-existent? The answer is yes. There was not a moment, there were epochs of time, and before time even existed, humankind did not exist. What does that mean? That you were non-existent. When you were non-existent, did you choose yourself to come into existence? The answer is no. So someone willed for you to come into existence. So that's just one verse of the Quran. Like this, you have numerous verses. إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ. Verses which mention in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the differing of the night and the day. The signs, ayat. There are signs for whom? Those who think. يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. So throughout the Quran you have various types of arguments. لو كان فيهما آلهة إلا الله لفسدتا. If there were a God, a deity in the heavens and the earth other than Allah, the heavens and the earth would be in chaos. So you read and study the Quran, you will find various types of arguments.
Do you want to go next?
You mentioned qasd as the acquisition of the action. The Maturidis call this ikhtiyar. Is there any difference between the two? If there is no difference, why was there two phrases formed?
The wording qasb is from the Quran. So the Ash'aris chose the wording from the Quran. When you study the Ash'ari school in more depth, you will realize they are the closest, or they are in fact upon the Quran and Sunnah, the most than any other group. The Maturidis, they chose a different word because of their regional locations. There are some jargons, istilah, that may differ, but it's just a regional thing. They lived in Ma Wara al-Nahr and they had their own jargon. The Ash'aris were embattling numerous groups, the Mu'tazila, the Qadariyya, the Jabariyya in Baghdad, because Baghdad was a place of fitna. Even in the time of Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani radiyallahu anhu, before he started his da'wah, they mentioned that Baghdad had so many fitan, tribulation, even today. So when the Ash'aris were embattling these different groups, they developed their Kalaam more than the Maturidis. So the Ash'ari Kalaam is more developed.
I've got a question somebody's asked. Is there a simple way to understand God's existence without so much philosophy and logic and reason?
Yes, there is. The old woman, she was asked, why do you believe in God? She says, when I cook my pot every day and I stir the contents, I see the contents turn because I'm turning the contents. And then when I look at the sky and I see the sun and the sun rising and the sun setting and the phases of the moon throughout the month and the stars and the constellations changing every 3 months, I know someone is rotating the universe. So I believe in a God. And that is the iman of the old women, and that is what Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi meant. Oh Allah, give me death on the iman of the old woman, meaning in yaqeen, in certainty.
Final question, because apologies, we have to recite Salatul Isha shortly. So the final question from Prophet Masood.
So this one says, how is the belief in the Mujaddid that is sent every century different to the Shia belief of Imam? And I just want to add something else you to consider. You mentioned Speaker's Corner. A lot of the da'is there, they tend to use Ash'ari Kalaam to deal with Christians and atheists, whilst they are very critical of it at the same time. What's the deal with that?
So there's two things here. The first one was with regard to
Mujaddid al-Imam.
How is the concept of Mujaddid different to Imam of the Shia? Mujaddid is not ma'asum, number one. Number two, Mujaddid is not one. There can be numerous Mujaddideen. in various places. Thirdly, believing a specific person is a mujaddid is not a tenet of our faith. With the Shia, they believe Allah is obliged to send down imams. And they believe in the specific imams that they designate. This is why you have the branches. The Zaydis believe in different imams. The Ismailiyah believe in different imams. The Twelvers believe in different imams. And then they do takfir of one another. They declare one another as unbelievers. With regard to Hyde Park, I believe some of the du'at in Hyde Park have become Ash'ari. At least, I have it from a good source, at least 30% of them have become Ash'aris who haven't come out the closet. I'm advising them, come out the closet, join the Jamhur of the Muslims, and the Ash'aris from, you can avoid the label Ash'ari, I mean Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The Salaf, from As-Salaf Salihun. The Ash'aris were just a continuation of that tradition in the form of Imam al-Bayhaqi, Ibn Hajar. You know all the names, all these names. They were what? A continuation of the way of As-Salaf Salihun. So Hyde Park lads, come back to the Ash'ari way, and those who are you in the cupboard, in the closet, come out of your closet.
Jazakumullah khairan. Apologies, we have to finish because Salat al-Isha. I would just like to thank our honourable guest, Sidi Asrar, for his, mashallah, excellent explanation, and also all of the hard work he does. It's very difficult being at the front, especially teaching Islam. There's lots of people that don't like us for various different reasons, even within our own communities. Allah give them the ability to do more, inshallah, work for Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'at, and also